Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. This time, we're going deep into, well, a group that calls themselves the Science of Identity Foundation.
Yeah,
They present themselves as, a branch of Hinduism, but
right.
we've got some leaked documents, personal accounts, and honestly, it's painting a picture that's a lot closer to what most people would call a cult.
Yeah, definitely a lot of those classic hallmarks there.
Yeah. And we're going to be looking at, well, everything really, from the leader, Chris Butler,
Right.
all the way to the impact it's had on families, and
hmm
even some pretty disturbing allegations of, well, criminal activity.
Yeah, and what makes this deep dive really interesting is we actually get to look at this group through the eyes of people who were born into it.
Right.
We've got Rama Ranson, who eventually left the group,
Okay.
and his brother, Laxmana, who's actually still a devoted member.
Wow.
So their totally different views, I think, offer a really unique perspective on how cults can impact people, even within the same family.
Okay, so let's start with this Chris Butler guy. He's the leader, and from what I'm seeing in these documents, he's living a life that's pretty lavish.
Yeah.
I mean, especially for someone who's supposed to be, a spiritual leader. We're talking multiple mansions, a house lined with tinfoil.
Right.
It's all a little jarring, to be honest.
Yeah, it's a pattern you see a lot with cult leaders.
Yeah.
All this personal wealth and extravagance while they're preaching, about spirituality and detachment from material things.
Mm.
And it just makes you question, where's all this money coming from? Who's really benefiting from the followers' devotion?
Right.
And with Butler, there are even some allegations of drug trafficking orchestrated through, like, high-ranking members like this guy, Patrick Bowler.
Whoa. Hold on, drug trafficking.
Yeah,
I mean, that's taking things to a whole other level.
it is.
How do they stop people from questioning this stuff? I mean, wouldn't someone at least raise an eyebrow at the lifestyle or the accusations?
Well, that's where this idea of thought reform comes in. See, it's not so much about physical force or anything like that. It's more about controlling people's minds and emotions.
Right.
So it's like they create an environment where even questioning the leader is like this huge taboo. It sees a lack of faith.
Mm-hmm.
And questioning can lead to serious consequences, like being ostracized from the community, even your own family.
Right. Yeah. But I mean, are we like overusing the word cult here? Because I mean, some of these things like discouraging dissent,
Right.
couldn't that be found in, less extreme spiritual groups too? What
Yeah.
makes this situation so different?
Well, it's true that a lot of groups have, rules and hierarchies and stuff.
Right.
But in a cult, that control is way more pervasive.
Yeah.
It extends to every part of a member's life, who they talk to, what they read, even what they wear.
Mm.
Like this group, they've got strict rules against members associated with other Krishna devotees, or even just looking at information that criticizes the group.
Wow. And this control really seems to have devastating effects on families. Especially, I mean, if someone tries to leave, like this Rama Ranson guy,
Right.
he was excommunicated, totally cut off from his family, just for criticizing the group. He even wrote letters to his grandparents, begging them to see the manipulation, but they didn't listen.
Yeah, it's really sad. And Rama's story isn't unique either.
Yeah.
That separation that cults impose, it can be incredibly traumatic.
Yeah.
Imagine you're not just losing your community, but your entire family, because you dared to question their teachings.
It's awful.
And it's one of the most heartbreaking things about cults, the way they exploit that human need for connection, for belonging, and turn it into a weapon.
Absolutely. And this control seems even stronger for those who are born into the group, like the second generation, as they're sometimes called, like Rama and his brother Laxmana.
Right.
They were literally raised to see Chris Butler as their only spiritual guide. It makes sense that it'd be hard to see things from an outsider's perspective.
Oh, absolutely. From the moment they're born, they're immersed in the group's ideology. They're taught that the outside world is dangerous, that only Chris Butler has the answers. It's indoctrination from childhood.
Wow.
But even in that controlled environment, you see individuals react differently. Rama, he chose to rebel, to leave. But his brother, Laxmana, he fully embraced the group's teachings, and he's still a staunch defender of Chris Butler.
It's fascinating how their paths diverged so much. It kind of shows that even within this system of intense control, there's still room for individual agency. Maybe there's hope for those who are still trapped, but we're dealing with some heavy stuff here.
Yeah.
Let's take a moment to think about what we've learned so far before we move on.
Yeah, I think that's important to just acknowledge the weight of these stories and the emotional and psychological complexities of cults.
Absolutely.
It's easy to get caught up in the psychological manipulation side of things.
Right.
But we can't forget about the financial exploitation that often goes along with these kinds of groups.
Yeah, that's true. We did touch on the drug trafficking allegations, which
Yeah.
are, super disturbing.
Right.
But what about more like everyday financial practices? Are there signs that this group is like taking advantage of its members financially?
Well, there are some red flags for sure. Like this guy, Nimai Van Den Bos.
Okay.
So he's a childhood friend of Rama's who's still in the group.
Right.
And he's allegedly involved in some shady real estate dealings, like possibly renting out empty villas, maybe even for money laundering purposes.
That's, that sounds pretty suspicious.
Yeah.
If it's happening with one member,
Right.
it makes you wonder how widespread this kind of thing might be, right?
Exactly.
Is there any evidence that, that this financial exploitation is, like, systematic?
It's tough to say for sure without seeing their internal financial records.
Yeah.
But when you combine these allegations with Butler's, extravagant lifestyle,
Right.
it definitely raises some serious questions.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole issue of Sri Shim's death.
Okay.
He was a high-ranking member of the group, and the circumstances surrounding his death are, well, they're really troubling.
Like, what do you mean? What happened?
Well, some former members are actually claiming that it was a murder that the group covered up.
Hold on, a murder cover-up? That's a huge accusation.
It is.
What evidence is there to back that up?
Well, concrete evidence is, it's hard to come by,
Yeah.
especially when you're dealing with a group that's known for its secrecy.
Right.
But there are definitely some inconsistencies in the official account of Sri Shim's death that are, well, they're pretty suspicious.
Okay, like what?
Well, some witnesses say they saw bruises on his body that weren't mentioned in any reports, and others claim that some key people who were involved were quickly moved out of the country.
This whole thing sounds like something out of a movie.
It does, doesn't it?
But how do they get away with this stuff? You'd think if there were suspicions of murder and financial crimes, that the authorities would be all over it.
Well, cults are often very good at avoiding scrutiny. They might operate in remote locations, create complex financial structures,
Right.
use their close-knit community to enforce silence and protect their leaders.
Makes sense?
And then there's the power of belief, too.
Yeah.
A lot of members are so indoctrinated that they would just dismiss any negative information as lies or attacks from outsiders.
It's frustrating, that these things could be happening and no one's being held accountable.
Yeah.
It makes me think back to Rama and Lakshmana, the two brothers.
Right.
With such completely different views on this group,
Yeah.
their conversations really show how differently people can experience the same reality. Like, Lakshmana seems totally blind to the manipulation, to the abuse,
Yeah.
while Rama sees it all so clearly.
Their story is fascinating because it's not just a disagreement about beliefs.
Right.
It's two brothers who fundamentally disagree on what's real. Lakshmana believes that Chris Butler is, this benevolent spiritual guide. And Rama sees him as a manipulative and dangerous cult leader.
It's like they're living in two completely different worlds.
Yeah, it really is.
And what's even more heartbreaking is that their parents, under the influence of this group,
Right.
they sided with Lakshmana and cut ties with Rama completely. It's such a stark reminder of how cults can tear families apart.
It really is. That division within families, it's a common theme in cult cases. The group often becomes the only source of identity and belonging for its members.
Right.
It overshadows even the closest family bonds.
Yeah.
And when someone challenges the group or tries to leave,
Right.
they're seen as a threat, an enemy,
Yeah.
someone to be shunned and silenced.
It's just tragic. But it also makes you wonder, is it even possible to break free from this kind of control? Can someone like Lakshmana, who's so deeply entrenched in the group's ideology, can they ever see things differently?
It's definitely possible,
Okay.
but it's a challenging process.
Yeah.
And often a very painful one.
Right.
It requires questioning everything you've ever believed,
Yeah.
confronting the fact that you might have been deceived, and then rebuilding your life from scratch.
And I imagine that's even harder when you're surrounded by people who are still under the group's influence.
Oh, absolutely. They're constantly reinforcing the group's narrative,
Right.
making it that much harder to break free.
So what can we do? If we suspect that someone we know might be involved in something like this,
Yeah.
what's the best way to approach the situation?
The most important thing is to stay open, and avoid being judgmental.
Okay.
Remember, people in cults are often victims.
Right.
They might not even realize they're in a harmful situation. So instead of trying to force them out,
Right.
focus on listening,
Okay.
expressing your concerns,
Right.
and encouraging them to, think critically about the group's teachings.
So it's like a balancing act.
It is.
You want to support them
Right.
and not enable the harmful behavior.
Exactly.
Oh.
And you have to respect their right to make their own choices, even if you don't agree with them.
It's tough.
It is. But at the end of the day, the decision to leave has to come from the individual themselves.
Yeah.
You can provide support and resources, but you can't force someone to change their mind.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from the leader's lifestyle and the allegations of criminal activity
Right.
to the impact on families and the difficulty of breaking free from a cult's control.
It's a complex and often disturbing picture,
Yeah.
but it's important to bring these practices to light and understand how they affect people.
Absolutely. Man, this deep dive has been pretty intense, to say the least.
Yeah.
I think what really gets to me is how easily anyone could get caught up in something like this,
Right.
It's not about being like gullible or weak-willed or anything.
Oh.
Cults, they prey on, I don't know, like basic human needs, the need to belong, to have a purpose.
Exactly. It's not about, intelligence or strength.
Right.
Anyone can be vulnerable to these tactics, especially if they're going through a tough time.
Yeah.
They offer this sense of community, clear rules to live by, and the promise of something bigger than yourself.
Right.
It can be really seductive.
Yeah, it's like once you're in, they just do everything they can to keep you there. They isolate you from the outside world, control what information you see.
Right.
Use fear and guilt to, I don't know, keep you in line.
Exactly. It's a system designed to break down your sense of self and replace it with the group's ideology.
Yeah.
You basically become dependent on the group for everything, your identity, your values, even your sense of reality.
Wow.
So leaving becomes incredibly difficult, even when you start to see the problems.
So what can we do? Like, to protect ourselves and, our loved ones from falling into these traps. It's one thing to talk about the dangers, but how do we actually spot the warning signs?
Well, one of the biggest red flags is a group that demands absolute obedience to a single leader. Someone who claims they have the only truth or the only path to enlightenment.
Okay.
If someone says you can only find happiness or salvation through them, that's a huge warning sign.
So it's all about healthy skepticism.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to ask questions, challenge authority, get outside perspectives.
Exactly.
What about if you think someone is already involved in something like this? How do you even approach that?
Well, the most important thing is to keep those lines of communication open.
Right.
And avoid judgment.
Okay.
Remember, people in these groups are often victims of manipulation. They may not even realize they're in a harmful situation.
So instead of trying to force them out,
Right.
you just listen, express your concerns, and maybe try to encourage them to think critically about what the group's teaching.
Exactly.
It's a tough situation though, right?
It is. You want to be supportive, but not enable the harmful behavior.
Right.
And you have to respect their right to make their own decisions, even if you disagree.
It's hard.
It really is.
Yes.
But ultimately, the decision to leave has to come from them.
Right.
You can offer support and resources, but you can't force them to change their mind.
Well, I think this has been a really eye-opening deep dive.
Yeah.
We've learned about how cults use these, I don't know, insidious tactics to control their members,
Right.
the devastating impact they have on people and families,
Yeah.
and how hard it is to break free from their influence.
It's important to be aware of these dangers,
Right.
but there's always hope.
Yeah.
People do escape from cults. They recover
Right.
and rebuild their lives.
It's a real testament to the resilience of the human spirit, I guess,
It really is.
and to the power of critical thinking.
Absolutely.
So if there's one thing to take away from this whole deep dive, it's this. Don't be afraid to question authority. Think for yourself and trust your gut.
And remember, you're not alone. There are resources available if you or someone you know is struggling with this.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We hope it's been informative, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit empowering.
As always, thanks for listening.
Stay curious, stay critical, and we'll see you next time.